January 1915, a ship is supposed to return to Antarctica. It never does. On the ice, a small group of men watches the horizon for weeks, then months, then a full year. They don't realize they're not missing, they're not lost. They have been abandoned in the coldest place on Earth for a mission that may no longer matter. This is the Ross Sea Party, and the rescue will not come in time. In the early years of the 20th century, Antarctica was not yet a place of science. It was a frontier, undefined, unmapped, and deeply hostile to human life. Exploration of the southern continent was driven by ambition, rivalry, and reputation. Reaching the South Pole had become a symbol of national pride, and survival itself was proof of human dominance over nature. By 1914, one man stood at the center of this world, Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton was not chasing the pole for the first time. He had already come close and failed. But failure did not diminish his ambition, it sharpened it. This time, he planned something far greater than a race. His new goal was total, to cross the entire Antarctic continent from sea to sea. The plan was bold, complex, and unforgiving. 2 ships, 2 teams, 2 opposite sides of the continent. Shackleton himself would lead the main party, landing on the Weddell seaside. From there, his team would march across the Antarctic interior, pass through the South Pole, and continue until they reached the Ross Sea. But such a crossing would be impossible without support. The second team, later known as the Ross Sea Party, had a single critical task. They were to land on the opposite side of Antarctica and lay a chain of supply depots across the ice: food, fuel, equipment, carefully placed markers that Shackleton's crossing party would rely on to survive the final stages of the journey. Without those depots, the crossing could not succeed. On paper, it seemed straightforward. In reality, it was the most dangerous part of the entire expedition. The Ross Sea Party was assembled quickly and with little scrutiny. Shackleton's focus remained fixed on his own crossing team. The men chosen for the Ross Seaside were a mix of sailors, scientists, and volunteers, many with limited polar experience. They were not given the best equipment. They were not given the strongest leadership structure. They were not given the same attention. Their ship, the Aurora, had already seen hard service. Supplies were inconsistent. Clothing was outdated. Dogs were poorly trained. Mechanical support was unreliable. Even before leaving port, cracks were visible. Leadership was divided. Ernest McIntosh was appointed commander of the Ross Sea Party, but real authority was blurred. Several men answered to different chains of command. Decisions were debated rather than executed. In Antarctica, hesitation is fatal. Still, in late 1914, Aurora sailed south toward the Ross Sea, carrying the men who would soon be asked to perform one of the most physically punishing tasks in polar history. They believed Shackleton would be crossing the continent toward them. They believed time was critical. They believed rescue would follow. By January 1915, Aurora reached the Ross Sea and anchored near Cape Evans, a place already marked by the remains of earlier Antarctic expeditions. The environment was immediately hostile. The ice shifted constantly. Winds screamed across the surface. Temperatures dropped with little warning. Landing supplies required speed and precision, both in short supply. Despite the challenges, the men established the base on shore and began unloading equipment, dogs, and food. Their mission had officially begun. Almost immediately, problems emerged. Sea ice thickened faster than expected. Blizzards disrupted schedules. Dogs weakened. Men fell ill. Yet pressure mounted. McIntosh believed supply depots had to be laid immediately, even though it was late in the season and conditions were deteriorating. Waiting until the following year would be safer. But waiting risked failing Shackleton, so the Ross Sea Party moved forward. Teams set out onto the ice, hauling sledges overloaded with supplies. Each step was labor. The surface was uneven. Soft snow alternated with hard ice. Crevices were hidden beneath thin crusts. Progress was measured in exhaustion rather than distance. Within days, frostbite appeared. Within weeks, injuries accumulated. Equipment failed repeatedly. The dogs, meant to lighten the workload, struggled under poor handling in unfamiliar conditions. Still, depots were placed, markers were planted, flags were raised, food was cached beneath the snow. Each mile forward came at a physical cost. By the time the first season ended, several men were already weakened. Their bodies had been pushed beyond what Antarctic winter would later demand of them. They returned to base believing they had done enough, for now. What they did not know was that the real disaster was approaching, not from the ice, but from the sea. In May 1915, as winter closed in, Aurora lay anchored to the ice near the shore. The ship was meant to remain there through the winter, serving as shelter, storage, and the only means of eventual rescue. Then, without warning, a violent storm struck. The ice around the ship began to fracture. Anchors strained, lines snapped. In the chaos of wind and darkness, Aurora was torn free from its moorings. The ship drifted helplessly into the frozen sea. On shore, the men could only watch. They had no control. They had no way to reach the ship. They had no power to stop what was happening. By morning, Aurora was gone, carried away into the ice with most of the supplies still on board. Food, fuel, clothing, medical equipment, gone. The men left on shore stood in silence. They had not planned for this. No contingency existed. No rescue protocol was in place. At first, many believed Aurora would return. It had survived storms before. It had strong engines. Surely it would fight its way back. But days passed, then weeks. No ship appeared. Slowly, a truth became impossible to ignore. They were alone, on the Ross ice shelf, with winter approaching and without the majority of their supplies. The Ross Sea Party became something else entirely. Not a support team, not an expedition, but a group of men stranded at the edge of the world. And worse, they still believed Shackleton was coming. As winter settled in, temperatures dropped further. Darkness consumed the horizon. The sun disappeared for months. Inside their makeshift shelters, the men took inventory. What remained was barely enough to survive, let alone complete their mission. Yet McIntosh faced a choice. If they abandoned the depot-laying effort, Shackleton's crossing party might die. If they continued, the Ross Sea Party might die instead. He chose the mission. Despite weakened bodies, despite missing supplies, despite the unknown fate of Aurora, preparations resumed. The men would go back onto the ice. They would lay their remaining depots. They would finish the task or collapse trying. What none of them knew was that Shackleton's crossing had already failed. The supplies they were risking their lives to place might never be used. But that truth lay far beyond the ice and far beyond their reach. By the time the Antarctic winter loosened its grip, the men of the Ross Sea Party were already diminished. Months of darkness had passed with no sign of Aurora. Rations had been cut repeatedly. Fuel was rationed to the point where heat became a luxury rather than a constant. Their clothing, never intended for prolonged isolation, had deteriorated. Boots stiffened beyond repair, gloves split, sleeping bags lost insulation. But when the sun returned, hesitation was no longer an option. The depots still had to be laid. In September 1915, the men prepared for what would become the most punishing phase of the entire expedition. They were weaker than they had been the year before. Several suffered lingering injuries. Others showed early signs of malnutrition. Despite this, sledges were loaded. Food tins, fuel cans, flags, and markers were stacked onto runners that weighed far more than their handlers could reasonably manage. Dogs, once considered an asset, were now unreliable. Some were sick, others had already died. Much of the hauling would be done by men. They set out southward from their base toward the barrier, following routes carved the previous season, routes now partially erased by snow and drift. Progress was slow. Each mile demanded hours of effort. Snow swallowed boots to the knee, wind erased visibility, ice burned exposed skin raw. Rest periods grew shorter, marches grew longer, and still they pushed on. As weeks passed, physical decline became impossible to ignore. Men who once led the march now struggled to rise in the morning. Hands swelled and stiffened, legs weakened under load. Then came the first unmistakable signs of scurvy. Gums bled without injury, teeth loosened, old wounds reopened. The disease did not strike suddenly, it crept in. A stiffness here, a soreness there, fatigue that no rest could reverse. Fresh food was non-existent. Seal meat, when available, helped slow the progression, but hunting required energy they no longer had. And still, McIntosh ordered the march to continue. Each depot placed was another step deeper into exhaustion. By December 1915, the Ross Sea Party reached the southernmost point required for the supply chain. The final depot was placed at Mount Hope, a symbolic name heavy with irony. The men were now at the edge of their physical limits. One of them, Arnold Spencer Smith, collapsed. He could no longer stand. His legs failed entirely, swollen and useless. Pain consumed him. Scurvy had advanced rapidly. There was no question of leaving him behind. The decision was made to haul him back north on a sledge. This choice would change everything. The return journey was supposed to be faster. Instead, it became a prolonged descent into collapse. Pulling an injured man added immense weight. Progress slowed to a crawl. Weather worsened. Blizzards forced long halts. Whiteouts erased direction. Cold deepened into something sharper, more aggressive. Food ran low again. Each ration cut weakened the entire group. Men fell repeatedly. Hands shook uncontrollably. Speech slurred under exhaustion. Spencer Smith's condition worsened. Painkillers were gone. Movement caused agony. He drifted in and out of awareness. Still, they moved. Stopping meant death. On March 9, 1916, Arnold Spencer Smith died. He did not die suddenly. His body simply gave up. The men buried him in the snow, marking the spot as best they could. There was no ceremony. There was no time. The march had to continue, but the death changed everything. Fear became tangible. If one could die, any of them could. As the party struggled northward, another crisis emerged. Aeneas McIntosh, already weakened by scurvy, grew increasingly impaired. Victor Hayward, suffering similar symptoms, could barely walk. When the group reached the point near Hut Point, conditions deteriorated rapidly. A blizzard trapped them for days. When it lifted, McIntosh made a decision. He believed the sea ice between their position and the hut would hold. Despite warnings, despite their physical condition, McIntosh and Hayward set out alone, attempting to cross the ice and reach shelter ahead of the others. They were never seen again. The ice broke. The men vanished. No bodies were recovered. No final words recorded. Only absence. The remaining members of the Ross Sea Party were now few and barely functional. Scurvy ravaged their bodies. Walking became painful. Standing required effort. Simple tasks took minutes instead of seconds. Yet survival demanded movement. They pressed on toward Hut Point, dragging sledges lighter now only because supplies were gone. Each day followed the same pattern. Wake, struggle into frozen clothing, haul, collapse. By the time they reached shelter, they were no longer explorers. They were survivors. Inside the hut, they rationed what little remained. Seal meat became their primary sustenance. Recovery was slow, measured in weeks, not days. Bones healed imperfectly. Gums receded. Strength returned unevenly. They waited and waited. In January 1917, nearly 2 years after Aurora had vanished, a ship appeared. It was Aurora. She had survived. After drifting, trapped in ice for months, she had finally escaped. Damaged, depleted, but intact. A rescue party led by Ernest Shackleton himself landed on the Ross Sea shore. They found survivors. They counted the dead. 3 men were gone. The supplies laid across the barrier, the supplies that had cost so much, were never needed. Shackleton's crossing had failed long before. The Ross Sea Party had completed their mission, but they had done so without knowing whether it still mattered. They had marched, suffered, and died in isolation, cut off not just from rescue, but from information. They had acted on faith alone, and faith in Antarctica offers no protection. When Aurora finally reached the Ross Sea in January 1917, the Antarctic summer was already advanced. The coastline appeared unchanged. The ice stretched outward in familiar silence, but on land, everything had been reduced. The men who emerged to meet the ship were thin, weakened, and slow-moving. Their clothing hung loosely. Their faces carried the marks of prolonged malnutrition and illness. Shackleton quickly understood the situation. The Ross Sea Party had survived, but at a severe cost. 3 men were missing. Arnold Spencer Smith had died during the return march. Aeneas McIntosh and Victor Hayward had vanished on the sea ice months earlier. There was no uncertainty about their fate. The Antarctic had taken them. Once the survivors were safely aboard Aurora, the expedition shifted into recovery and documentation. Medical examinations confirmed the extent of scurvy, frost damage, and physical deterioration. Some men could barely stand without assistance. Others struggled to eat solid food after months of limited rations. Records were gathered, journals were collected, depot locations were confirmed, Timelines were reconstructed. Only then did the full picture become clear. While the Ross Sea Party had continued laying depots under the assumption that Shackleton's crossing was underway, the crossing itself had already failed. The supplies placed across the barrier, the supplies that had driven men beyond collapse, had never been required. The mission they believed they were supporting no longer existed. In February 1917, Aurora departed the Ross Sea. The remaining members of the Ross Sea Party left Antarctica behind after more than 2 years of isolation, hardship, and loss. They carried with them the personal effects of those who had died, journals, tools, and small items recovered from the ice. The bodies of McIntosh and Hayward were never found. Spencer Smith's grave remained marked only by the snow and ice that covered it. As Aurora turned north, the huts and supply depots disappeared from view. The Antarctic returned to silence. The men arrived back in New Zealand physically altered. Recovery was slow. Some injuries never fully healed. Scurvy left lasting damage. Exhaustion lingered long after warmth and food returned. Official reports were written. The expedition was closed. The Ross Sea Party was formally recognized as having completed its assigned task, despite the circumstances under which it had been carried out. No further searches were mounted. No additional recoveries were possible. The Antarctic chapter of the expedition ended quietly. Years later, the details of the Ross Sea Party remained fragmented across journals, reports, and personal accounts. What could be confirmed was simple. The men had followed orders based on information they never received. They had continued marching under assumptions that were no longer true. They had endured conditions far beyond what their mission required. They had completed their work without knowing whether it still mattered. When rescue finally arrived, the task was already over. The Ross Sea Party did not vanish suddenly. They did not disappear without trace. They remained on the ice, working, marching, and waiting long after the world had moved on. Their story ended not with discovery or triumph, but with departure. A ship returned, the survivors boarded, the ice closed behind them, and Antarctica kept what it had already claimed. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more real expeditions that pushed human endurance to its limits, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and there are many more still waiting to be told.